Well, joining me now in our series of new voices. This is a new voice here on the right, Alina Voss. Most recently, she just got her master's. She's a public policy graduate from the Harvard Kennedy School. She was the co-chair of the Harvard Republican Caucus. She has served in government at a few places, NASA, SBA, GSA, before getting into policy. She's written extensively on particularly sort of market-based solutions on the issues of conservation. And I think I've seen the word pragmatic used to describe her views when it comes to policy solutions. You can campaign for some things, but in order to enact, sometimes you have to make compromises. So, Alina Voss, welcome. Nice to meet you.
Thank you so much for having me.
First of all, since I did that intro of you, anything you'd like to correct, amend, or
Not
otherwise
particularly.
add to?
These days, I'm no longer with the government. I've made it firmly over into environmental policy world, and I'm working with a nonprofit called American Conservation Coalition. I'm also a fellow with Conserve America. So we've got kind of the eco right, as it were, um, building up.
And this has been fascinating to me to watch grow over the last decade, because it's clearly, I think the issue of the environment almost is more generational than it is ideological. There's certainly your typical business versus the environmentalist mindset that's always kind of there, and certainly and always an undertow. But this is not a clean issue on party, because you're not an outlier among folks under the age of 40 when it comes to concern about the climate.
No, definitely not. And I think something that you see with younger generations, certainly in Gen Z, is that for a while you were hearing from conservatives and like Gen Z Republicans that would say, "Oh, I'm a conservative on everything except the environment." And they would
Hmm.
always add that caveat at the end. And I think it's really interesting because certainly in older generations, this was not always the case, certainly in the 80s, 90s, and the
Hmm.
aughts. But I think more and more you are hearing younger conservatives go, "Well, obviously I care about the environment." And it's more a matter of the vocabulary that we use, the
Right.
policy solutions, and sort of whether or not they find it pragmatic enough. But whether or not the planet matters is no longer up for debate, at least in my generation.
It's interesting. I grew up in Florida where I grew up, my dad was pretty conservative, but he always drew the line in the environment. Like he always saw that. But he also argued, preservation of the environment is a conservative act. And sort of, wanting to not mess with the ability to fish, wanting to not mess with the ability to hunt in nature, right? That there is that preservation, setting aside lands, that is a form of conservatism. But you and I were just discussing before we went on that unfortunately the words are just don't work, or kind of meaningless to people, aren't they?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've been seeing that I find quite interesting is this distinction between preservation and conservation, which I
Mm,
think is a really interesting starting point, especially on issues of sportsmanship and things like that. Whereas you have preservation, which I would argue has primarily been the ethos of the left, of kind of nature is best when man hasn't touched it.
mhm,
The Earth's natural state is kind of with no human
mm,
fingerprints on it. That is our baseline that we sort of philosophically operate with. Versus conservation, which is, like I would argue a hunter or a fisherman sees the world as, no, I'm going to fish, but we want to make sure that we don't overfish. Or I'm going to
right.
hunt, but because the deer population is out of control, and this is part of conserving the environment, not
Mm,
preserving it away from human hands, but conserving it for humans. And I think that that has kind of been lost in the conversation. It's been
mm,
very all or nothing, including on the right. I mean, I think that the drill baby drill and just
right.
like scrape the environment for everything it's worth hasn't really been a pragmatic strategy for the
Mm.
future. Certainly as far as our natural resources go. But I think these kind of underlying philosophies are interesting and are a lot more of the conversation than we typically allow them to be.
That's a great distinction. I have not heard it articulated like that, preservation, conservation, but that's an interesting distinction, and I totally see where you're going there. One of the things that I've found to be a bit head scratching with this current environment energy policy in this White House is that it's not all of the above, right? Like I was sort of, I've fallen, I thought, what's wrong with all of the above? I mean, if solar's going to work, let's do it in Nevada and Arizona and Texas and wind and all this stuff. Like, let's try it all because I view it almost as an insurance policy, right? I don't think anything's going to happen to my house, but guess what? My bank is going to make me get an insurance policy in case something happens. Yes, we're primarily using a certain type of energy, but don't we want an insurance policy in case we need to diversify our resources? So I would think that there's almost an ideological and a market-based argument to make for diversifying our energy resources.
I would definitely argue that there is, mostly because they all have pros and cons. I think, unfortunately, due to politics mostly, we've had a lot of overcorrections in both directions over the past 15, 20 years, what have you, saying let's subsidize the heck out of something and just make it work, even if it's not really appropriate for a given use case. Or in the other
Mhm.
direction, kind of artificially penalizing renewables just because they're associated with the people that we don't like. And I find this quite unfortunate, mostly because I would argue that, as someone who pays an electrical bill, it does matter whether or not we're using the right tools for the right jobs. I don't think that artificially subsidizing something out of
Mhm.
its utility, just because it sounds nice or we have like specific renewables goals, I don't think that
Mhm.
that's typically pragmatic, certainly for an electrical grid. Or even sometimes just when you see residential solar and people are uh, getting these things installed that are super, super cheap, but there's a rug pull effect if those tax credits ever go away or things like that, where it was kind of artificially inflated. But no, to your
No,
point,
I take your point on that, but one of my frustrations on solar in particular, and I'll just give Florida as an example, is that the power company that sort of dominates down there, right? We don't really have power competition around the country. Um, they just randomly make it very difficult. They don't want to hook up your solar panels. They don't want to give you those credits back, whatever you're helping with on the grid. Um, and so to me, there's something that's got to be done there at the utility level to allow consumers to decide for themselves.
yeah, I would definitely argue that. I think it's also interesting. I don't know if there was a recent report that just came out talking about how wind and solar aren't really reducing energy costs, which I find interesting. I haven't done enough
Hmm.
research into it to understand why, because it seems quite counterintuitive. But no, in general, I think that the sort of all of the above approach should be using the right things for the right jobs. I also think that we've kind of lumped together all fossil fuels, which I find a little frustrating.
Mm,
Most of our sort of carbon emissions cuts in the last 20 years have been due not to switching to renewables, but switching from coal to natural gas electricity production at
right.
the grid level. Um, I know that a lot of young people kind of use fossil fuels as this catch-all for like the type of energy that we don't want. But I think being a little bit more pragmatic and having more of a fine-tooth comb there and saying, well, not all fossil fuels are created equal.
Right.
Frankly, a lot of the reason that we got rid of coal or started phasing it out was for market-based reasons. It just simply could not economically compete with nuclear and natural gas.
Oh, I love
And
to
I think that
remind people
it's
the coal industry got harmed more by fracking than it did by government.
100%.
Right.
100%. And that is market-based energy policy, is saying
Right.
we're not going to pick the winners and losers, allow the energy to compete for itself
Hmm.
within reason. I mean, if there were a magical plutonium energy source, I don't know, something from
Hmm.
kryptonite, from Superman, that was
No,
going
there's this
to,
magical deposit on the moon we keep thinking we're going to find. Remember?
that would be
Helium
lovely.
3.
But
Who
if
knows?
but if we find it and we realize that it kills 200 people a day,
Hmm.
I do think that it's okay if the government steps in and says, you know what, this probably isn't in the best interests of everyone.
Hmm.
At the same time, I think that we're usually getting ahead of our skis by saying, we need to
Hmm.
phase out all natural gas because it's just not feasible. And unfortunately, we've seen this happen in Germany, we've seen it overseas. You don't get renewables when you get rid of natural gas. You mostly just go back to coal, which I think is backsliding.
That's a fair point. There's a reason results matter more than promises. Just like there's a reason Morgan and Morgan has become America's largest injury law firm. For the last 35 years, they've recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. It includes cases where insurance companies offered next to nothing, short of shortchanging, seeing if they could get away with it. And Morgan and Morgan fought back, and they won millions. In Pennsylvania, one client was awarded $26 million. It was a staggering 40 times the amount that the insurance company originally offered. That offer, $650,000, whatever it took to sort of get away without paying. So with more than 1,000 lawyers across the country, Morgan & Morgan knows how to deliver for everyday people. So if you're injured, you're looking for a lawyer, check out forthepeople.com/Toddcast or dial pound law, pound 529 on your cell phone. And remember, all law firms are not the same. So give Morgan & Morgan a look. Their fee is free unless they win. Let's give me a little bit of your origin story. How'd you get into politics? What made you want to jump into politics and policy and government? How'd you get the bug, as I like to say?
So I actually started as a tech person. My history has all been primarily working in software development, somewhat tech policy.
Where'd you grow up, by the way?
I grew up in Buffalo, New York.
Okay.
So
Oh, there you go.
red dot in the blue state.
Contractually obligated to always pull for the Buffalo Bills, I used to say.
Oh, thank you.
Back at my
We
old,
really need it right now. The past two before the bye week were pretty rough.
Yeah, you may have a head coach on the hot seat soon, but we'll see.
I certainly he is with the fans. But
So I
he can win us back, I'm hoping. It's been
winning
tough.
cures all. Winning cures all. Anyway, go ahead about the tech industry. Sorry.
Yeah, so I got into politics because I loved the feeling of losing growing up with the Bills. No, I genuinely just enjoyed using tech skills for purposes that I felt helped people. I did a lot of sort of volunteer work in college. I worked with United Nations groups that would like map out countries where women were getting evacuated for female genital mutilation, things like that, where it's like, oh, I didn't realize that technology could help this specific cause. And I just found it fascinating. That kind of took me into state and local politics, doing some political websites. I worked on election technology in New York before grad school. During grad school, I ended up in a bunch of different startups, and that's super fun. But if you've ever done the startup life, it burns you out pretty quickly. And then made my way to DC.
Startups are made for 20 somethings. That's what I like.
Yes. It's a phase everyone should have, but
100%. And a good startup, everybody's got to do every job. Who's taking out the garbage? Who's getting lunch? Who gets to do this, right? Like everybody has to do everything in a startup.
Well, and it's a great way, I think, to cut your teeth on skills that you aren't super familiar with. Certainly coming from state and local technology, I was not at the level of a lot of the better programmers or software designers. So kind of having to learn it and having an opportunity to learn it because you're on such a small team and there's no one else to do it. It was a fantastic learning experience. And then, yeah, I ended up in the federal contracting scene after that, which was super fun and kind of a continuation of using tech for other purposes.
So that's how you worked at NASA, SBA, and GSA as a contractor. Yes. It is a different relationship, a federal contractor versus an employee.
It is.
How would you describe the distinction?
I would say that at least when you work in tech, it doesn't feel that different at all. You basically report to work with your badge and your laptop, and it feels effectively like you work in the agency. Most of the time, every contract's different. Because the government has sort of outsourced so much of its technology for so long, and that's, been undone in fits and starts, and maybe it's undone again after DOGE. I don't really keep up with what's happening these months. But it is interesting because I think that historically the government has kind of had this idea where you simply just buy things off a shelf, and that doesn't really work for technology. You either integrate the team so that they're feeling like they're actually working in the government, or you end up with an inferior product, which, to be clear, they do sometimes.
So the argument I've heard for outsourcing for this and why you hire contractors is that, frankly, it just speeds up the implementation time. In that if you were trying to do this within this procurement process of government and trying to train up the people to work on it, that all of it would just it adds time. And then by the time you install said technology, it's behind.
I would agree with that. A lot of it is a personnel issue, right? Like if you need to build something, you don't necessarily know if you need a Drupal developer, something else, whatever. If you have a contracting company that can switch those heads around really quickly, you have a lot more agility. Unfortunately, the way that federal hiring works, one, they're terrible at hiring tech talent to begin with. Again, this has improved in recent years, but broad strokes here. For a while, there were agencies that were requiring a computer science degree to work in these sorts of things because they're very sort of credentialized when it comes to hiring. I don't know if you know much about the field, but someone with a computer science degree is not very likely to be working as a
that's the issue.
software engineer.
Right. I have a pretty good friend who was at CISA, back
Yeah.
and forth. And, she's been a chief of staff there. And then that one of the things that they started to push were these to create the opportunity for people that work at these big tech companies
Yep.
to do essentially 18-month stints, 2 month,
Yep.
excuse me, 18 months, 2 years. It's almost like a tour of duty, a little public service. And that had become it was a way, at least in CISA, to improve their abilities across the board, and essentially raise the floor of knowledge in the entire department.
Yeah, they began that kind of in the wake of the 2008 Healthcare.gov
Hmm.
crash, that I
Debacle,
think
yeah.
made it very apparent that the way that your technology implementation ends up can reflect poorly on whatever policy it was, even if there's no real relation in between the two. I mean, when Healthcare.gov just kind of flopped with its
Right,
launch, because they hadn't prepared properly, they hadn't tested properly, it looked like Obamacare was the cause, and
right.
certainly it impacted people's trust in the system.
Sure.
And so they started 18F, they started U.S. Digital Service, which is now DOGE.
Doge, right, yeah.
In response to that, because you had a bunch of Silicon Valley people saying, look, I'm down to come help. I would love to come help, but this is a nightmare to work with. You guys
Right,
won't accept my application because I, maybe didn't graduate high school, even though I'm a top Facebook
right.
engineer. Like, get out of the way and let me work. I'm not dealing with your red tape, but I'm happy to come help. And that's where a lot of that sort of originated. And I do think that at least in its early years, it was working very efficiently. I would
Hmm.
argue up until recently. Um, and I think Trump and Elon have kind of added back some of the things that they initially doged out of the picture.
Right.
Um, to their credit, I mean, these are
Well,
things that
like
we need.
I say this a lot about some of the things um that the goals Trump has are noble. The execution is horrendous. Right? Doge was something that is necessary. I'd love to see something, but how the execution actually set things back when you could have created something that might have actually made some progress at sort of streamlining government and doing these things, but the way they went about it, implementation is everything. You just made the point about Obamacare. Was it the policy or was it the website, right? Like how you implement and unveil it matters. And unfortunately, I think a lot of trust has gone away because of Doge. I mean, Doge is something that the idea behind it is a good idea. The execution was horrendous.
I think it's difficult, especially when you have kind of these 4-year stints, and certainly when you're a second term
Hmm.
president, like this
Right.
is your shot. Um, I would argue that a lot of the Republicans have kind of tried these sorts of things before, and it was just on too long of a time horizon to really
Hmm.
work, especially once the admin changes, nothing's going to happen. Unfortunately, I was at GSA. I did get doged. I was one of the early folks because I was at ground zero.
Yeah. You get
Um,
a T-shirt. I've been Doged.
they don't. I
That's
think
pretty
it's lost
nice,
in the
right?
mail at least.
Yeah.
Um, but it was a little bit like looking at someone, a house flipper going at load-bearing beams where you're like, no, we need that one.
Right.
The the work that I was doing at the time got added back by executive order, I think a month later, which was so frustrating because you're going, we were already doing that.
We told
But
you, right? And you get this a lot in government. I mean, it's funny you talk about the 4-year thing, right?
yeah.
And you have the career government people, right? And they're used to the little bit of this seesaw. But in some ways, don't underestimate that government person that's actually been able to navigate two ideologically different administrations and
Yeah.
be functional. That actually is probably a pretty nimble employee that you want to keep around.
100%, especially at agencies like GSA and SBA, like kind of the unsexy ones that don't attract
They're
people.
not super
At NASA, we
political,
called it the
right?
t-shirt effect. So like there
Yeah.
there were people who want to work at NASA because of the NASA t-shirt. It just looks really cool.
Not
You
just the
don't,
t-shirt. You get a bunch of other stuff too. Don't you get cool jackets and like, I mean, come on, not just t-shirts, right?
yeah, my spacesuit is up hanging next
Okay.
to my wedding dress in my closet. I need to preserve it or something,
As
but
if as the spacesuit should have been your wedding dress. Come on.
it
You
should
know.
have. Unfortunately, I couldn't get clearance for it. Um, but it's white enough. I mean, it works.
There you go.
But no, I mean, you don't have people going into GSA, and certainly you don't have people
Right.
going into things like 18F and US Digital Service because they want the glory. If they wanted the glory or they wanted the money, they would not be there. I do think that there's a ton of waste. I certainly saw it at
Hmm.
GSA. There were a lot of folks who had been in the system for quite a while and were very comfortable with their jobs and effectively retired, just kind of
Hmm.
waiting on that to fall.
Right.
I think one of the most difficult things is how difficult it is to get rid of anyone who is in the government. You just can't fire people. You can't nudge them out the same way that you can in private companies, which
Hmm.
I do think is a reason that we need to be focusing on smaller government in the first place, because people are so sticky. And I do think it's a point for contracting is that you have that sort of agility as far as human resources.
Let me throw bizarre, maybe it's not even that bizarre of an idea that because I accept the premise that you get some government workers who either get comfortable or in some ways they have a job. It's kind of outdated because maybe just technology has made it semi-outdated, but they have the protection. Um, that in, I'll just give an example. When I worked at NBC, I signed a contract that technically said they could make me work from any place in the world, right? Even though I believed I was signing up just for Washington, D.C., but they can make me work any place in the world. If you work for government, can they technically, well, wait, no, your job's still here, but now it's in the Forest Service. Now it's in the, you know, now it's in the State Department. Now it's in the Labor Department. Um, I don't know if that's a case with these government union contracts, but I wonder if you had a little more flexibility at moving people to other agencies, because you know what that really actually does is it convinces them, maybe I should leave government.
I think that would be one way to do it.
Mhm.
I think part of the issue is that you kind of get so much institutional knowledge because there are so many nuts and bolts. I mean,
Hmm.
I worked on a lot of data sharing initiatives. It is impossible for even individual agencies to share their data between, not just because of technological issues, those are, I would say, the most easily solvable, but
Hmm.
because people will hold on to it like Gollum with the ring and go, no, you can't have my data because that is my security. And I think you see this with a lot
Mm.
of
That's their job
issues.
security.
That's their
That's the
job
way they look at
security,
it.
and kind
Yeah.
of being these sort of memory holes is their
Hmm.
job security because contractors may turn over, and contractors are
Right.
often doing the bulk of the work for a lot of people. I was fortunate to have some really great bosses, but that is the case on a lot of contracts.
Mm.
But having that sort of institutional knowledge and knowing, oh, you might think that that policy works that way, but it doesn't, is where these people get their power.
Hmm.
And it's also why they're so much more difficult to move around, because
Right.
someone who is a star at GSA probably won't
Mm.
work quite as well at the Forest Service.
Um, Looking at today's conservative movement, who do you who's interesting to you? Who do you look at and say, boy, I can't wait to see what they do next? Maybe it's a member of Congress, maybe it's a senator, maybe it's a governor, maybe it's somebody that's running that you haven't seen yet. I'm just curious.
I would say living in Ohio, I'm very curious about Vivek.
Hmm.
I have had a lot of like strong opinions on him, both positive and negative, over the past couple of years. So I'm mostly just
He
curious to see how
inspires
that one
that.
plays out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've had him on my podcast. He is a loquacious person, and
Yes.
it's something I appreciate about him is that he talks to anybody, willing to go anywhere, right? I think that's a good attitude to have if you're running for public office. Um, but he does sometimes speak before he thinks.
I think so too. I also think that during the early days of his campaigns, he was kind of getting arguably too many of his opinions from Twitter. You can kind of tell when someone's like really online because you
Super
go
online, the super onliners,
like,
yes.
yeah, and those two
Oh,
ideas
there's a
aren't
certain.
actually
I'm
compatible.
not gonna bait you, but there's a certain senator out west who just, I want to say, dude, get off the internet. You've got a family. Go hang out with them, please. Don't be
I
so
know exactly who
based,
you mean.
Mike. Come on, you
Yeah.
know.
And I think that can be difficult, A, for, I mean, go be with your family, but B, just because sometimes if you're saying, like, we can't have any government spending into one industry, but also I want to build a bunch of nuclear reactors, it's like, hold on.
Hmm.
These two ideas probably did come across your Twitter feed, but when you're kind of getting things in 120 character policy bites, it
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily make something a holistic worldview or a holistic policy view.
Are you
I think it's getting
demanding?
better.
Are you demanding that ideas be sound? I mean, I just, how dare you?
I have lots of demands. They're not being met, but I can try.
I know. I always say that logic got banned in Washington. I used to say that to my staff all the time. Logic doesn't work. You don't have to. If you apply logic to politics, you'll actually be behind, not ahead, unfortunately. Um, Well, that's going to be an interesting race because I don't, I know the conventional wisdom says he's just going to roll in that. And I don't know. I don't know. I think Mike DeWine is the perfect Republican for Ohio. Like I think he is like if sort of, if you put Ohio on a chart, and say, Mike DeWine Republicanism is at, slot 62. That's where Ohio is, where Vivek is a little bit further to his right, where DeWine and, Ohio, and you look at the governors, all the Republican governors they've had in sort of my lifetime, Kasich and Taft and
He's
DeWine.
much more in
Right.
DeWine is much more in line with those guys. Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's I would say that most Ohioans, from what I've seen, I'm pretty new here to be fair,
Mhm.
are I don't want to say
Yeah,
moderate,
Buffalo's
but like
very similar
tame.
though. You live on a lake, you live on one of the
Yeah,
big ones. Yeah, no, 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 no. Buffalo, to me, you're honorary Midwest because
that's what I've
Buffalo,
always said.
no, Buffalo's the Midwest of New York, right? Like,
Yeah,
this is what makes New York so interesting to me as a state. After you take away New York City and the rest of New York would be a swing state, right? It is a
100%.
very it looks, it's much more like Wisconsin or Michigan or Ohio than it is a Massachusetts or a Connecticut or something like that. So no, I think as a Buffalonian, you can claim some Midwestern roots. But my father, who grew up in Iowa, didn't even think Ohio was the Midwest. But I digress.
Now that is shocking. No, the New York thing is interesting. I don't know how true it is, but I heard that the New York State Assembly, at least the Republicans in it, used to end a lot of meetings chanting "West Virginia did it, West Virginia did it," chanting for secession from Long Island, which
Yeah,
I
well, the
find
irony of
inspiring
West
as a conservative.
Virginia,
That'd be great, but
yeah, the irony of West Virginia, is now West Virginia is more southern than Virginia, but we can
yeah,
debate that. Yeah.
topsy-turvy world.
Hmm. Well, I take it the Senate race is not as intriguing to you, huh?
Not quite. Or at
Mhm.
least I haven't been as clued into it. Since I work out of DC, a lot of my politics really does just revolve around climate and conservation issues these days, which I won't say that it's not uh, heated, but it is more filled with people, I think, who are looking for solutions on both sides.
Well, you get at something that I just, I don't know why it's so hard not to be solutions focused. And if you have a good solution, I'll just be cynical here. I can fit an ideology to support it. You know what I mean? Like you can find your way to it if it's a good solution.
I think so. I do think though that like the ideology does matter, and that we've on both sides ditched it to our detriment. I think that's
Hmm.
what makes it incoherent and non-cohesive policy for a lot of people is they're going, wait a sec, this is okay when we do it in situation A, but not okay when we do it in situation
Hmm.
B. Um, and I think that the climate is a very good example of that. You're hearing a lot of times from the right that like the environment doesn't matter or that we need to drill baby drill. And then we kind of turn around and say, oh, our public lands do matter. And I think people talking out of both sides of their mouths really do get frustrating. And conservatives are annoyed when the left does this, right? Like they're
Sure.
annoyed that we're saying things need to be more affordable while actively torpedoing affordable energy and spiking people's energy bills, or I
Right.
mean, really just spiking all of their bills. Anytime the cost of energy goes up, the cost of everything goes up.
Right.
Um, and I
Do you,
think, sorry.
how much have you been focused on this, on the impact of the data centers on the grid? And is this going to be where the average Americans are going to be paying for this in higher electric bills? Is there a direct impact?
I do think there's a direct impact, is my analysis at least. I also think that if states are smart, they will do kind of what Pennsylvania has done and say, all right, Microsoft, you team up with Constellation,
Hmm.
you get your energy from there, both because it's more reliable and the data centers have an incentive to want that more reliable energy, and
Hmm.
because it'll bring the consumer prices down. There has been more of a push, shockingly enough, to get data centers to pay what they actually use. I'm not as clued into why that needed to be done in the first place. I kind of assumed that we just metered things properly, but apparently not.
Mm.
Um, I I don't think that they are like as catastrophic as a lot of times the left will make them out to be environmentally. I think that there are ways around this. We have plenty of sources of emission-free
Hmm.
energy, and I think nuclear is probably the best suited for data centers because it's running all the time, which makes it not always perfect for every other application.
Right.
But data centers are too, so it works very well there. So I think it's a definite issue that's coming down the pipeline. The other thing that I don't think that we talk nearly enough about is transmission. We talk a lot about the energy and not
Hmm.
nearly enough about how it gets to where it's going. Same with
Right.
storage. I think batteries and to some degree hydropower for pump fuel storage um,
Is
will be
this one of
important.
those things that everybody will suddenly pay attention when we have like a massive grid failure in Texas? Like I keep waiting for that Texas grid, which feels very shaky at times, in winter and stuff that, one bad summer or one bad winter, and then that sort of everybody realizes, oh, we've got to have a better understanding of transmission.
I think transmission definitely will be. I will say I was at a nuclear conference in Texas last week, and
Hmm.
um, obviously I'm shooting fish in a barrel here, but everyone seemed to know what time it was for Texas's grid, and there was quite a lot of talk, both on
I
transmission
mean,
and just energy
right.
creation.
People are nervous about it, right? I
Yeah,
mean, I've got
I'm
a
more
friend who
excited
made a
about it from
boatload of
a new
money.
energy projects.
I have a friend who
Yeah,
was on the deregulation bandwagon, made a boatload of money off of it, and is really nervous now.
really.
Yeah. Just because it
Yeah.
feels as if there's not enough. He said he's not a big fan of government regulation. He goes, I don't feel like the government's on top of this enough. That was his concern. It's almost letting the too much, too much of the inspections and all of that. Just not enough government involvement was his concern, which is interesting for me to hear this from someone like him.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways to do it, to do the deregulation and to make it work. Unfortunately, you have to have smart policy that aligns incentives. And unfortunately, when you have power providers that aren't on the hook when something goes wrong,
Right.
well, you have kind of misaligned incentives. And of course, they're not necessarily going to care if something goes under. I think insurance is a policy tool that we don't use nearly enough, requiring
Hmm.
insurance for these sorts of things. Um, I think that's a very good policy tool to use for gun control, but that's another
Oh, good luck getting people to do
another
insurance.
conversation. But
It's funny, but you're not wrong on that. And it would be it's a market solution, right? You sort
yeah,
of, it's no different than saying you're pricing carbon. You're pricing risk is what you're doing when you do
yeah.
insurance, right? Yeah. Let me get you out of here on this. Do you imagine you're going to have run for your 30 years from now? Will you have run for office?
If something goes horribly wrong, which is mostly how I hear most politicians end up that way, then you can vote for Alina Voss.
So what you're saying is, no, in all
I hope
seriousness,
not.
you don't want interesting, but you can't
I
say
hope
you would
not.
never. Why is that?
I can't say that I would never do it, mostly because I could see myself getting fed up enough with the current state of things to just
Right.
pull the plug and go for it. At the same time, I have not seen very much from current politicians to suggest that it's a effective way of making change for a lot of them. I
Yeah.
also think that it just seems like so many people destroy their souls in it. I plan to build a family, and certainly leading them into just the absolute
Yeah.
hysteria that is the state of modern politics sounds terrible. Um, I don't need protesters showing up at my house because they sometimes
And
wrongly
that's a
think I voted
bummer.
on
I mean,
something. Yeah.
it's interesting that I worry that it's self-selecting and only only then that means you only have certain types of basically people. What I hate right now is politics is becoming a home for the people for what I call failed celebrities,
Yeah.
people that wanted to be famous doing something else couldn't and said, all right, now I'm going to try politics. And you're just like, ugh. And it just feels like every time you think we can't dumb it down more, somebody like, oh, Stephen A. Smith says, hold my beer. Um, and watch what I could do with this. Well, look, don't give up on the system. You haven't given up on policy. Um, but I love that you used the word incentives a lot. I've been obsessed. A friend of mine pointed out an old Milton Friedman quote about incentives. And it's not about whether you elect good people or bad people. It's all
Yep.
about whether you have good incentives or bad incentives. Good people will do bad things with bad incentives, and which we see right now in the U.S. Congress. There's a lot of good people in that Congress. their incentive is not to do good things right now.
They'll rationalize it to themselves once they do.
Right. Exactly. Alina, it's great to get to know you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on.
I hope my Packers play your Bills in the Super Bowl. That would be a big win for small Midwestern cities on the Great Lakes.
It'd be great. And maybe we can get our 5th fall.
There you go. All right. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.